Well, thank you for inviting me to this conference. It's always a pleasure being in Istanbul. And when I come to Istanbul, it reminds me of how much similarity there is between Tehran and the city and the culture of the two nations. And I think that's partially the theme of what I want to say in these 10 minutes. I think that when we speak about the international community, of course, we're usually, in Iran, we're making reference to the United States and the fact that it considers itself and its close allies to be the international community. Whereas, obviously, for Iran, that's not an acceptable definition. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the United States is moving away from what it likes to see as preeminence in this part of the world. And there is a partial withdrawal. And this is obvious for a host of reasons that you all know as well as I do, if not better. The economic crisis that we're seeing since 2008, the internal difficulties that the United States faces, the exhaustion after 15 years of endless war, and the rise of powers such as China, which has emptied the United States of much of its industry, thus the easy victory of President Trump in key industrial states in the United States over Clinton, despite the fact that the media overwhelmingly supported her. So this creates a geopolitical and geoeconomic vacuum for the region, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because when we look at what the United States has done in this region over the past few decades, a lessened presence could be a good thing. Of course, the United States' support for Israel, an apartheid state, which, as we just saw a couple of days ago, the report which more or less declared that Israel was an apartheid regime or behaved as an apartheid regime was immediately withdrawn in the UN. Similar to the statement, the blacklisting of Saudi Arabia on Yemen, where the Saudis are creating mass hunger in the country, with American support, of course. And then we see the United States immediately, the United Nations immediately removing Saudi Arabia out of the blacklist within 4 days. It's similar how these two countries are dealt with. So one is Palestine, of course, Libya, the United States, Western countries, as well as countries in our region. Again, their involvement in Libya has led to the destruction of the country. The United States' involvement in Syria, which I'll get to shortly, and of course, Iraq. The US involvement in Iraq, of course, it doesn't begin with the occupation of Kuwait. It begins when the United States supported Saddam Hussein, along with countries like regional countries, certain regional countries, in its invasion of Iran. The United States and EU countries provided, what are today called the EU countries, provided Saddam Hussein with chemical weapons to use. And of course, Afghanistan, which is, I think, perhaps the most significant, because what the United States did in Afghanistan, and I think I discussed this 5 years ago in this hotel at the Istanbul Forum, that what the United States did in Afghanistan with Saudi Arabia has led to implications that we are still dealing with today, not just in Afghanistan, but in Pakistan. Pakistan, for example, which hosted the extremists, they were a conservative society, religious, but the sort of suicide attacks and violence that we see in Pakistan today were non-existent before. Afghanistan, of course, is still in crisis, and that's one reason why the Afghan government has such poor relations with Pakistan, because of the influence of extremist groups like the Taliban and the complicated relationship that Pakistan has, the ISI in Pakistan has with these groups. And then I want to get briefly the US role in Syria, and because it defines how the Iranian response. The US role in Syria defines the Iranian response. We now know, of course, I think Iranian intelligence was saying this from very early. We now know that Biden at Harvard University said that there are no moderates in Syria. But the narrative in the United States and the US media has always been that the United States is supporting the moderates. We now know through WikiLeaks that Hillary Clinton, in her emails, that we know that in 2014, countries like Saudi Arabia were still supporting ISIS. These are WikiLeaks documents. Hillary Clinton. We know now that, according to the Defense Intelligence Agency document that was partially released in 2012, and the Defense Intelligence Agency is the most important military intelligence organization in the United States with almost 20,000 people involved, people employed in this department, in this part of the Pentagon. This part of this document, which was released, and I urge everyone really to read it, although I think many of you already have, it was actually released because of Libya and the role that the United States had in Libya and then transferring arms to Syria from Libya. But in the document, it is acknowledged that the United States knew that countries like Saudi Arabia were supporting extremists, that the extremists had from early on the upper hand in the violence in Syria among the militant groups. And the United States, according to General Flynn, Michael Flynn, in an interview on Al Jazeera, an interview that you must watch, I think, and I'm sure many of you have, he says that the United States took a willful decision to support these extremist groups that later on evolved into what we now know to be ISIS. But more interestingly for me is the meeting between Kerry and supporters of the militants at the Dutch mission in the UN on September the 22nd of 2016. In this leaked audio, Kerry admits that the United States allowed ISIS to advance on the Syrian capital in order to put pressure on the Syrian government. Of course, you will not see this in the mainstream media, but the file is there for everyone to read. This is extraordinary, because before, if you recall, the United States was constantly, the narrative and the think tank narrative in the United States was that the Syrian government created ISIS in order to create this sort of, again, binary as either us or them, regardless of the fact that all the ISIS leaders were in American prisons. But the United States allowed this group to advance on the capital. So, and the leak, by the way, was not in order to expose this. It was for another reason, and this didn't make the headlines. What made the headlines was that Kerry said, "I lost the debate in the White House over military strikes against Syria." But this, I think, is the key sentence or the key segment of the file. So from the Iranian perspective, what the United States is doing in this region, whether it's Syria, Yemen, Libya, Palestine, has been Iraq, Afghanistan, has been destructive. And the United States alliance with Saudi Arabia in Afghanistan, which ultimately led to blowback in 9/11, is being repeated at a much grander scale today in the region across the board. Why is this the case? There are many reasons, but from the Iranian perspective, the United States does not represent an international community that is it is hoping to bring about stability in this part of the world and to bring about a security apparatus that would be beneficial to all. So, since I only have 1 minute, I have to cut out everything else. I just very quickly want to point out that Saudi Arabia does not want rapprochement at the moment. The Iranians have just recently, the Saudi king was in China. The Chinese offered mediation, the Iranians accepted it, the Saudis rejected it. They want to, right now they're not in the mood for talking. Egypt, which Iran considers to be an extraordinarily important power in this region, and extraordinarily important culturally and as a force of moderation, at the moment it is facing internal difficulties, economic crises, issues, the political issues between the government, the brotherhood, and so on. Right at the moment, it cannot, I think, project much outside of its borders, unfortunately. But that leaves, and then of course Israel, as was pointed out earlier. Let me just give you 2 points on Israel and I'll finish. One is that the former head of Mossad on Al Jazeera said that Israel, he justifies Israel's support for Al-Qaeda, the Nusra Front in southern Syria, and aiding their injured and so on and so forth, because he said Israel is not specifically targeted by Al-Qaeda. This is on, again, an Al Jazeera interview. It's online for everyone to see. But more interestingly, the Israeli, the head of a think tank in Israel, the head of the Begin Sadat Center for Strategic Studies, he said that ISIL is a useful tool. So with Israel playing this sort of role again for Iran, there's no reason to see Israel as being in any way useful to any larger apparatus for security. At the moment, therefore, what remains is Iran and Turkey. Iran and Turkey, I think their relationship is highly mature, despite the differences that the countries have had over the past few years. I think, ironically, that shows the maturity of these two countries, that they did not allow differences over different issues to ruin their relationship. Turkey helped Iran when Iran needed help, when the United States was sanctioning the country, and Iran aided Turkey the night of the coup. Iran was the first country to support the legitimate Turkish government in this country. And it was its responsibility to do so. So I think the fact that Iran and Turkey both have similar cultures, they have civilizations, they have participatory politics, true deficiencies, problems, but it is unlike those countries that export Wahhabism, that promote intolerance. So I think that the key right now, at this moment, is for Iran and Turkey to work together to bring about greater stability.
Thank you so much.